Dear church, should Christians read science fiction? That is the question that we'll be answering today with David Lopez. Hello and welcome to the Dear Church podcast. I'm your host, Chris McCurley. I'm excited about David Lopez being with us again. David has been our college minister for the last couple of years at Oldham Lane. He is moving on, going to move to Tucson, Arizona with his family to teach school. And so we wish him well with that. And we're going to miss you, David. You know that I've said we're not happy about this, but we are happy for you and your family. But you're going to be hard to replace. We just thank you so much for the time you've spent with us here at Oldham Lane, but we wish you well. So thank you for joining us one last time on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Yeah. And hopefully this won't be the last time. Maybe we can have you on via, FaceTime or something like that to talk about how you're doing and maybe have you on for a different topic. But today we're talking about science fiction, something that you have a little bit of expertise in, especially since you just wrote a book that is science fiction, Christian-based science fiction. Talk a little bit about the book you just completed and when it'll be available, how people can get a hold of it.
Well, the book is called Novel One, and the premise behind the book is that in a post-apocalyptic dystopian world shaped by the virus Novel One, twin brothers fight the odds in traveling orphanages called enclaves.
Okay.
The idea behind the book came from 2020 and that whole experience with COVID. And what I wanted to do was take some of the restrictions that were placed upon society during that time and to kind of put an inverse on them. So in this book, for example, there is a virus that compels people to stay outdoors and 6 feet, within 6 feet of other people. And if you're not, you become an alien zombie.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, it's just it's a way to explore kind of the social ramifications of what it means to live in a collection of people, and trying to see if trying to make some kind of commentary on some of the things that people experienced during COVID using this imaginary situation.
Yeah. So when will it be available?
It will be available August 1st. It's on pre-order now, so if anybody who wants to go on and pre-order, it's ready now, but the actual release date is August 1st.
So do you find it at Amazon? Where do you find it at?
Yes, you can find it on Amazon. You can also go to my website, durrellel.com, durrellel.com.
Yeah. So pre-order on Amazon, comes out August 1st. Novel One is the name of the book. And so this kind of spurred a conversation that you and I were having that we're going to have today. And that is, what about reading science fiction? Because I know that has been a source of controversy for some Christians, Harry Potter and other books like that we shouldn't be reading about those kind of things because it is anti-Christian. And I certainly, don't want to diminish anyone's beliefs on that. If they don't want to read Harry Potter, that's fine. That's up to them. I don't hold that view, but some do. So it kind of brought up the discussion about science fiction and specifically, Christian science fiction, which is what you're kind of, the angle you're kind of coming from. But talk a little bit about that and kind of your view, your take on that and Christians reading something. I know that I read a lot of books to help me with sermons, but there are some times when I want to read for leisure, for pleasure, and just read something that, doesn't have to do with my work or my job or things like that. So there are times when I venture out into that. I like sci-fi, I like Star Wars and Star Trek and those kind of things. But what would you say to someone who is maybe looking at science fiction and saying, is this really something that we should be diving into as Christians or staying away from?
I think the first question that we need to consider is, what is science fiction? Yeah. And once we kind of understand what science fiction is, then you can kind of go into the question of, should Christians be reading science fiction?
Because there's levels of it, right? Yeah.
Yes, sir. So when I think about science fiction, I like what the great science fiction author Isaac Asimov says about it. He says, science fiction can be defined as that branch of literature which deals with the reaction of human beings to changes in science and technology. So the idea here is that science fiction relies on technology and science for its plots. One example would be Mary Shelley's Frankenstein versus Bram Stoker's Dracula. Both of those books are horror stories, but Frankenstein is sci-fi, because technology is the means by which the book explores the human reaction of what it means for humans to create life, which is what science is trying to do. Many scientists today they're trying to create life and whatnot. But science fiction is kind of a sliding scale, like most of fiction. You have what we can call hard sci-fi, which is a book like Andy Weir's The Martian. These are books that emphasize the science in science fiction. They're driven by scientific concepts and technologies. They have detailed scientific explanations, and they prioritize the natural sciences like math, physics, biology, chemistry. And then you have, on the other side of the scale, soft science fiction, which is where novel one lands. An example of this would be my favorite short story, Daniel Keyes' Flowers for Algernon. Mm-hmm. These books emphasize the fiction in science fiction. They're driven more by philosophical concepts and themes. They usually don't have detailed scientific explanations. However, they prioritize the social sciences like psychology, politics, and sociology.
Okay.
So with that said, we ask the question, should Christians read science fiction? And there are two camps on this.
Yeah.
One camp would say that reading science fiction is to support falsehoods, is to support wasting time. Mm-hmm. This is actually the position that Robert Dabney held. He wrote a book called On Dangerous Reading. And he had two major concerns when it came to reading fiction.
Yeah.
The first one is that fiction is full of falsehoods. It uplifts the evil and downplays the good. He says this, and I'm not going to read this whole quote,
okay.
But he does say this: many novels are systems of error covertly embodying teaching and ruinous falsehoods. He goes on to say, there is one more reason against fictitious reading, simple, brief, and absolutely conclusive. All men who read novels will confess that usually they read them as an indulgence. Now, it is an indulgence which is not recreation, for it excites, wearies, and emasculates the mind even more than excessive mental labor. Then he goes on to say this: but every man is responsible to God for the improvement of every hour which is not devoted to wholesome creation. Novel reading is the murder of time. So in this camp, there would be Christians who would say, we as Christians should not follow cleverly devised fables, 2 Peter 1:16, and that since fiction is falsehood, since fiction is cleverly devised fables, we should not follow it.
Yeah.
He says here that we must, quote unquote, redeem the time, which we see in Ephesians 5:16. The idea is that fiction is a waste of time, and so you shouldn't be spending your time doing it. He actually conjoins that idea with another verse found in John 9:4, which says that Christians should know that the night comes, and so we should be out laboring for the kingdom. We should not be sitting at home reading fiction. Now, like you, I respect this position, but I would respectfully agree to disagree in love.
Yeah, I would think 14. You would say that since you wrote a book. You know.
Yeah. But I personally believe that Dabney's position, in principle, is biblically indefensible. I think it is true that there is some fiction that's out there that's so horrible that it is a waste of time and that it is not good. But I don't think that we can say that broadly for the vast majority of fiction.
It's like any form of entertainment, right? I mean, there are romance novels that, that maybe perhaps women are inclined to read. They have no business reading because of the nature, the material, the content in it, just as there are movies that we shouldn't be watching, or things of that nature. This kind of piggybacks well off of what our series has been and what aired last week, the last installment, which was Work, Rest, and Play. And we talked about play last week on the podcast that, obviously, recreation, leisure time is okay when it's done within the confines of what is permissible by God, but also what is, moral and legal, of course, and all those kind of things. So I think there's always nuance, and we've always got to be able to determine what is what do we need to steer clear of? And because I think anything like it's like the Christian that says we don't need to be on the internet. There's nothing good that happens on the internet. Well, that's not true. There are some good things that, 4 million people each day search for God on the internet. So we need to be a presence there, but it's how we handle it, right?
Yeah, and I think that is a good point to mention. The things that we say here about science fiction in particular can really be brought out to fiction in general.
Yeah.
There's a difference between watching a romance story about love, and it's another thing to watch a romance story that's erotica.
And about lust and all
and
that.
about lust. Mm-hmm. There's a big difference. So there's one camp that says Christians shouldn't read science fiction, shouldn't read fiction in general. And then there's another camp that argues that actually, no, fiction is good. It is something that's permissible. And if you have a talent for it, then just be a light in that realm. Uh-huh. There are actually 2 points to be said here. The first thing is that on this point that Christians should believe that Christians are okay with fiction, we can say that fiction connects us to God. I like what Kathleen Nielsen said in a video, why we should read novels. She says this: literature and stories in particular connect us to the creator of the universe, who created the world by speaking words and created us human beings to speak words in his image, to be able to make things in words like him and to be able to revel in words like him. If all of us were reading more novels, we'd understand even more deeply the beauty of our creator. This is interesting because J.R.R. Tolkien, to me, the greatest fantasy writer of all time, one of the greatest novelists ever. He's in my top 5.
Yeah.
He actually wrote a paper called On Fairy Stories where he argues that we express God's image whenever we tell stories. The idea here is that God is a storyteller. The Bible is his story. Mm-hmm. And we're more like God the more we grow as storytellers. We know, for example, that Jesus told a lot of stories.
Yeah.
And his stories were about telling truths. We call these parables. Now, Jesus wasn't doing anything new whenever he was teaching parables.
Right.
The form of what he was saying wasn't new. It was the content of what he was saying that made his story special. The idea here, if we extend the principle out, would be that all good fiction tells truths to varying degrees. And as much as reading good fiction tells truths, we as Christians should be encouraging that, especially amongst the Christian body.
Yeah. Yeah. So the one camp is never terrible. Don't ever even crack a book that's fiction. The other camp is, no, there's some good things to be gained by it. Like all things, maybe the truth is somewhere in the middle, maybe. Because, I can see how, Kathleen Nielsen and some of these that promote, reading fiction, obviously there's, it depends on what the fiction is, right? We've already mentioned that. But, there's some truths to be gleaned. There's some things to be gained from it. I can see that. What do you think about those who take a hardcore stance on movies or books like Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings that make us Lord of the Rings, especially J.R.R. Tolkien, definitely took a spiritual slant on things. C.S. Lewis did this as well. I think there's a lot of insight to be gained from those type of writers. What do you think about those who would say, no, we don't need to be diving into that because it only distracts us, it only hurts us as Christians? Do you think it should be that hardcore of a stance, even like with Harry Potter, that doesn't really have any spiritual implications and some would say would hurt us spiritually?
No, I don't think so. As you said, I think that we've been blessed with the mind from our Creator that allows us to enjoy recreation. And I think one form of recreation is writing novels. As also mentioned, I believe that telling stories and imbibing on stories, enjoying stories, connects us to God in a certain way, not in the same way that we would experience if we are pouring the scriptures into us.
Yeah.
But if we're honest with ourselves, we don't spend every hour of every day pouring scripture into ourselves. Mm-hmm. But we could be doing spiritual things which scripture permits. For example, we could be fellowshipping without reading any scripture, anybody giving any sermon, we could be fellowshipping, which is something that scripture encourages. And I think when it comes to reading fiction, is very similar. Matter of fact, I think there's a strong inference that can be had from Proverbs 4, 5 through 7, which tells us that in all the things that we need to get wisdom.
Yeah.
The idea here being that when we consider fiction, whether it be in the medium of movies or, as we're talking about, novels, there is a way of gaining insight from that particular medium, and so we shouldn't exclude that that form of insight if Scripture is telling us that we as people need to obligate ourselves to gaining insight. I like what W. Robert Godfrey says in a video, Westminster Answers Should Christian Read Fiction? He says this: literature is not only an expression of our creativity, but it's an expression of insight into God's creation.
Yeah.
Literature often helps us see the character of people, fallen people, and sin more clearly. I think sometimes reading a good novel is more revelatory of what are the problems of human relationships with one another and with God than are a number of books on theology. So the idea that Godfrey is pointing out is that wisdom demands that we gain insight into God's creation. God put the universe together with this weave called wisdom, and if we flow with the weave, then we gain the benefits of what it means to live a wise life. And if we flow against that weave, if we cut against that weave, then we're going to be receiving negative consequences and such. Mm-hmm. And so one insight into God's creation is that reading fiction has many beneficial habits that we as Christians could gain from.
Yeah.
There's an author Anne Pratchett, says this: reading fiction helps us feel empathy for people we've never met, living lives we couldn't possibly experience for ourselves, because the book puts us inside the character's skin. There's a video where I got this quote called, "Is reading fiction books good for you?" In there, Ali, the man who made this video, goes through a number of academic journals that evidence the wisdom of reading fiction. He mentions 5. 1, fiction helps us reduce prejudices and biases. 2, fiction helps with social cognition and empathy. 3, fiction helps us reduce stress and improve sleep. 4, fiction helps us boost vocabulary and language skills. And then finally, fiction may help with long-term cognitive functions, reduce cognitive decline, and slow down disorders like dementia. My point being here is that if we as Christians are people of wisdom, then we should be looking for those things that are most are most insightful when it comes to God's creation. And through this insight, we gain as much benefit from God's creation as we can. If God instilled into creation novel reading as a means to gain these kind of benefits, then I think we as Christians should promote these kind of benefits. Namely, we should be promoting novel reading. Mm-hmm. So, but again, this applies to any form of fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, whether it's movies, whatever the medium is, yes. There's boundaries, there's lines and things like that with anything. I think we as human beings are really good at taking something that's harmless or even good and perverting it, right? So we've got to be careful about that. What made you want to dive into writing and being an author?
Well, the main reasons that I wanted to get into this is because science fiction, writing in general, writing fiction can start conversations that change people.
Yeah.
I think about what Randy Newman says in an article, the book I keep rereading, and he's talking about C.S. Lewis and his book, The Screwtape Letters.
Great book.
Great book. Mm-hmm. He says, "I soon found the Screwtape Letters far more probing than entertaining. C.S. Lewis shines the light of Christian reflection on sin and temptation in revealing and disturbing ways. I view myself more honestly and turned from sin more decisively after eavesdropping on this diabolical dialogue."
Yeah.
Now, C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters isn't science fiction, but it does something that all good fiction does, which is it causes readers to pause and to think about life.
Yeah.
That's what it does. And so one reason that I got into writing fiction is because I want to do through my sci-fi what C.S. Lewis was able to do. Let someone eavesdrop on an important conversation and hopefully come out changed for the better.
Yeah.
That is the main reason I decided to go into novel writing, even though novel one is a novella.
Mm-hmm. But explain the difference between novel and novella.
It's a word count difference.
Okay.
A novella usually ranges between anywhere from 20 to near 40,000 words, and a novel is 40,000 words up. Mm-hmm. But it's really just a word count.
Yeah.
But then the second reason why I decided to get into novel reading is novel writing is because fiction is often secular, vulgar, and lewd, especially science fiction. There's no doubt about that.
Like most mediums nowadays.
Mm-hmm. But science fiction is very particular when it comes to this because a lot of the people who established science fiction, a lot of them were themselves scientists, and a lot of them as scientists were atheists, especially during the golden era of science fiction, the 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, where these new ideas on atheism and the Big Bang and all this was being promoted. Mm-hmm. Science fiction is known for its atheistic, naturalistic secularism. Many of the authors who established science fiction were non-believers, were unbelievers, and you can tell in their writings who they liked and who they didn't like. Mm-hmm. Religious characters are often presented as superficial, as stupid, and as bigoted, hypocritical. Mm-hmm. And religion is often seen as the enemy or causes some kind of bad situation which science has to fix.
Yeah.
And as a Christian, I believe that science is compatible with religion, and religion is compatible with science. And so I wanted to kind of get into this area and say, actually, there can be good quality science fiction written by people who support religious belief, religious sentiments, and belief in God. So I kind of wanted to push back against that. Moreover, science fiction is often vulgar and lewd. And when it comes to science fiction, there's no kind of there's no kind of lewdness, there's no kind of vulgarity that's as extreme or weird as what can be found in science fiction. And again, I wanted to push back against that. Like with my novella, novel one, there is no vulgarity, there's no sexually explicit content. In science fiction, typically, if you don't want that kind of material, you have to go to teenage science fiction. And teenage science fiction doesn't deal with adult content. It doesn't deal with adult drama.
Right.
And so I wanted to push back against that by saying, you know what? We can write quality fiction that isn't rampant with all these lustful images or these grotesque representations of sexuality and things like that. Mm-hmm. So those are the two main reasons why I decided to get into
it kind of bothers me when you look across the landscape and religious folks, Christians speak out and they want to ban certain materials and all this. But, so what's the alternative? Have you come up with an alternative? And some of those things are out of our reach. I can't make a movie. That's not me, but you'd like to see it when Christians offer an alternative instead of always pointing the finger and always bashing and saying, and rightfully so to some things, you shouldn't watch that, or you shouldn't, this shouldn't be available to teens or whatever it is. But what's the alternative? And you are providing an alternative. You're saying, a lot of the stuff that's being put out is not stuff that we need to be reading. However, here's something you can read. Here's something you can take enjoyment in, and that is a story that is interesting. It's one that teaches some lessons. There's a spiritual implication at the same time. It's not lewd, vulgar, and all that. And I think you see that with movies nowadays. When they first came out, some of the movies were pretty corny. They couldn't afford to get the really strong actors. But more and more you're seeing Christians, turning out movies that are less corny, that have a good message. That I think we're seeing more and more of that, turning out content that is contrary to what we see so often in our culture.
I mean, you take a movie like Top Gun, the newest movie. Spoiler alert, slight spoiler. There is a romance scene in there, but it was done so tastefully that the Christians that I went with to see it, we all turned to each other and said, "That was it?
Yeah.
That was it?" It was a short kiss.
Yeah.
And everything else was an implication. And you said that we were like, that's how you deal with this kind of material. Now, I want to be very clear. Novel one is weird. It is very weird. It is Lovecraftian. It's very weird. It is very uncomfortable. Like I tell people, I like writing phobia fiction.
Yeah.
I like to pick out phobias and try to accentuate them in my story. So, for example, in this book, claustrophobia is a big one. If you're somebody who's extremely introverted, who wouldn't like the idea of rubbing next to people for 10, 11 years, then this novel is actually for you.
Tight places is not my thing.
When I think about fiction and its importance, there's also one thing that keeps being brought up is how that fiction can be used as a means to gain a lesson. There's actually a quote by David Grubb in a video called Why Christians Should Read Fiction, and he says this, I really, really like this. Fiction allows an author to take control of the ideology, of the ideas, of the lessons, of the philosophy inside of his story, and permits him to more cleanly present characters as types, to more clearly show the relationship of causality and choice, to more clearly show the cost of good actions and the cost of bad actions. I think when it comes to any good fiction that Christians should be reading or should be watching, this is a major benefit that should never get overlooked. Grubbs' point is that fiction allows us to essentially synthesize reality into simple imaginary symbols and representations so we can more easily grasp lessons at hand. Trying to grasp a lesson by studying history and looking at, for example, first of all, you can gain lessons from studying history. It's a great place to gain lessons. But think about the history of Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. Many people don't get lessons from Adolf Hitler because his history is complex and he gets caricatured as, well, he's an evil guy, but then he gets caricatured to the point of saying he tried to do nothing positive. Right. He was 100% Satan, forgetting that a lot of Christians voted for Hitler during the time. There were things that he was doing socially that the German people thought was good. But then you go to Star Wars, Darth Vader, who is an evil guy, just as evil. But people love him. People adore his character. Why? Because a lot of people see a type of a character and they can more easily connect with him. They can more easily see his downfalls, his bads, and his goods. And they can take lessons from a character like Darth Vader. And so fiction and all these different fictitious mediums allows us to do that.
Yeah, this has been an interesting discussion. When you brought up this idea for the podcast, I thought, I'm always looking for content. I'm always looking for guests and always looking for new things to do and try. And this one was, I'll be honest with you, I thought this is a little out there, but I love David. I want to promote what he's doing as well. And this turned out to be a pretty interesting conversation. I hope everyone else found it interesting as well. And I appreciate you tuning in today. David, thank you so much for being with us today. And reminder that you can pre-order Novel 1. Comes out August 1st. Go to Amazon, pre-order, or go to your website, DurrellL.com. Durrell is actually your middle name. Yes, so you can go to that website and pre-order as well. And we thank you guys for tuning in. If you have a question, comment, you'd like to reach out to us, you can find us at chris.mccurley@rippleoflight.com. If you have a specific question or comment for David, we'll make sure that he gets it, and I'm sure he'd be willing to answer that for you. David, thanks again, buddy. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for tuning in. Spread the word about the podcast. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Sincerely, Chris. Chris.